Today, joining me to discuss the book of Salahuddin is renowned political activist, documentary filmmaker and author, Tariq Ali. Tariq Ali, thank you very much for joining us today. We begin with the Islam Quintet, if we may. It's well known that you were inspired to begin writing the Islam Quintet during the First Gulf War, when a BBC commentator remarked that the Arabs were a people without a political culture. But take us back to that day. After all, there have been numerous polemic and ultra-crepidarian attacks against Islam before. What was it about this particular one that prompted you to begin writing?
Well, the fact was that it was a remark made by someone who knew that this wasn't the case and still said it. And it was a remark made to justify the war that was being fought. And if you go back to that war now, the first Gulf War, when the United States organized people to go and get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and the argument used was that Iraq had violated Kuwaiti sovereignty, and it was the sovereignty of Kuwait that the West was going to defend. Subsequently, sovereignty doesn't matter at all. The sovereignty of Iraq, of Libya, of Afghanistan, violated at will. So, but to come back to the quintet, that was the starting point of the quintet, because I was just angered by that remark, and I was determined to respond to it, and I thought I'd respond to it with an essay, which is my normal mode. But when I went to do the research in Spain on the Islamic period in Spain, I was so amazed that I decided to write a novel and carried on till the end. So that is, you now have 5 novels to respond to that one remark.
Very detailed rebuttal there.
A very detailed
yeah,
rebuttal.
Do you remember who the commentator was at the time he made that remark?
I think it was Fred Halliday, which is what angered me.
Right,
okay. But maybe it was someone else as well. I know that Fred was appearing a lot to justify that war. Right. But I can't fully remember whether it was him or someone who came with him. It's a long time ago.
When you were researching about Islamic Spain, did you come across Allama Iqbal's research as well? When he went to
I did, but I was more interested in Spain, research that had been done in Spain and by Arab historians from the early centuries. That was much more interesting and important for me.
Your debut novel, Redemption, was a satire about hapless Trotskyites struggling to cope with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Why did you feel that was the right time to begin writing fiction, and what, if anything, had changed in the journalistic world to prompt that decision?
It was the only way one could write about this world, and it was a sort of therapeutic novel for me, to just get it out of my system. It's a closed world, a very sectarian world, and the only way to deal with it was through satire. So that's how it happened, and some liked it, some loved it, some hated it, some were indifferent, as is always the way. But that's, of all my fiction, that is now a cult book which you can't get hold of. And someone told me the other day, God, we saw it on eBay and they were wanting $300 for it. So it sold out, and it hasn't been reprinted again in English, but it has in other languages. So it was a way of, just expelling everything from my own head, and it worked.
I like the way they always kept referring back to the end of Stalinism, in terms of they couldn't quite comprehend exactly what had
happened. Yeah. And also, the other purpose of that was to show that many far-left groups of that period functioned in a very religious way. So Marx was the god, and then you could choose the prophets, Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. And then you felt that just by quoting either God directly or one of the prophets, your work was done. You didn't have to argue anymore. That's how religious people are.
Going back to the 60s for a while, it's to paraphrase Hunter S. Thompson, he described the period of political awakening in the 60s as a wave that hit the high water mark and then rolled back. Now, Was it, as Jack Bernstein cited, a conclusion to the New York, Moscow, Tel Aviv triangle, or was that rollback down to something else? And did it roll back?
Well, it rolled back to a certain extent, but it was what it achieved was very important, especially in the United States. I mean, the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, which developed in the United States, is a movement without parallel in imperial history. No such movements existed in Britain during the British Empire. During the period of the American Empire, that movement reached the peak and was very important in forcing the Americans to pull out. I mean, they were being defeated by the Vietnamese anyway, but this defeat at home was also equally important for them. I mean, when you're a general in the Pentagon and you have 100,000 soldiers in their uniforms, on their crutches, with all their highest awards, saying that they want the Vietnamese to win, then, you know, unless you're completely cut off from that world, you have to take it very seriously. So it was the combination of the Vietnamese military resistance and fight back on the battlefield and the political resistance by American citizens and ex-soldiers. That actually paved the way for the only real defeat the United States has suffered, ever.
Dawn on the last day. The last helicopter came in for a handful of US Marines, a humiliating end to the American presence. With the panache of a General Patton, the first North Vietnamese tank swept into Saigon. The last will and testament of Ho Chi Minh was being fulfilled. As the palace surrendered, the first Viet Cong reached Trudeau Street, delirious with joy. For the first time in 20 years, the face of Ho Chi Minh was on display. The defeated army did a striptease en masse, leaving their incriminating uniforms behind. For the victors, these were heady moments. Through their superbly coordinated offensive and the unexpected collapse of Saigon's forces, from start to finish, Operation Ho Chi Minh had lasted just 51 days.
What do you think were some of the factors that contributed to the rollback? Why didn't that momentum, why wasn't it galvanized and taken to the next decade?
Well, you know, movements are like that. They rise and they fall. And sometimes, if they're very successful, then they make revolutions or whatever. But that didn't happen in the 60s. I mean, in Europe, there were very strong movements, but they couldn't break the power of the ruling elites. Even in a country like Portugal, where they came the closest to doing it, they couldn't finally do it. I mean, in a curious way, the most successful movement was in Pakistan, where after 3 months of struggle, workers, students, peasants, the urban petty bourgeoisie in the cities, everyone, a real popular movement, fought for 3 months and then toppled the military dictator, which was very important. And the effects of this stay in the consciousness of the people, in the States, in Pakistan, everywhere. Even after the movement has abated, it becomes part of the historical memory. And recently, a few years ago, I was in the United States, in Wisconsin, where I was giving a speech, and after the end there was a reception, and at the reception was a Hispanic US soldier who'd just come back from a tour of duty in Iraq. At the same reception was an African-American Marine, former Marine, who'd fought in Vietnam, had stopped fighting, left the army and become an anti-war activist. And just, they were both talking. And so, you know, people's memories stay.
How has your political ideology, your outlook and strategy evolved over the years? How has it changed?
We live in very different times. And the big triumph of capital in the 1990s is only now beginning to be challenged, and that too not by mainstream political parties but by people from below. And even those who are challenging it, the indignados in Spain, the kids in Britain, elsewhere, have no alternative to it. So they challenge it within its own framework. So it's a very different period from the 60s. I mean, I remain an activist. You know, I've been very active in the campaigns against the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. But my main sort of work is writing and speaking, which I've been doing, especially more political stuff over the last 10 years since 9/11. Prior to that, I was doing a lot of documentary filmmaking, writing novels, etc.
Yeah, I saw your speech in July when you were telling members of the left wing that they must support the resistance even in Afghanistan. They can't pick and choose within that paradigm and say, on this hand we support the imperialists, but in that country we support the resistance. In Israel Shahak's Jewish History, Jewish Religion, The Weight of 3,000 Years, he puts forward an interesting criticism of Saladin. Chastising him for his leniency with the Jewish community, he says, and I quote, "The figure of Salahuddin is one which inspires profound respect, but his appointment of Maimonides as chief Nagid enabled the rabbi to issue orders to the Jewish courts in Egypt to seize all Jews who had gone through forbidden marriages and have them flogged until they agreed to divorce their wives." When I read the book of Salahuddin, Cairo 17, page 153, about Rabbi Maimonides' indiscretions in the house of Ibn Yaqub, it read like an allusion to Shahak. Was that intentional?
It wasn't intentional, you know. I mean, I know Shahak's work very well. I knew about all that. But I don't accept that criticism, because essentially what Salahuddin was trying to do was to get rid of the Crusaders by uniting with all the peoples who lived in the Arab world, which included Jews and which included Christians. Many Christians fought with him as well. So the war wasn't, in Salahuddin's eyes, a religious war as such. It was a war of liberation to get rid of the Crusaders who occupied Jerusalem and other Arab cities and carried out atrocities on an unimaginable scale. So it wasn't for him to say to the Jews, this is how you should live and this is how you shouldn't live. He left that to the Jewish community, which for the 12th century is quite advanced, you know, not to impose your own views on that of other communities.